In September 1985, 5 finance ministers gathered at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan and signed an agreement that would destroy the Japanese economy for 30 years. The document contained just 3 pages, but its consequences would ripple across decades, turning the world's most dynamic industrial power into a cautionary tale of stagnation and deflation. What those officials didn't realize was that they were activating the 3rd phase of a 4-stage currency trap that has ensnared every dominant economic power for the past century. This trap operates with the precision of a mechanical clock, ticking through predictable phases that appear different on the surface but follow an identical underlying logic. The British pound fell into it after World War II, losing its reserve currency status through a slow-motion collapse that took 2 decades. The Japanese yen plunged into it after the Plaza Accord, triggering an asset bubble that imploded with catastrophic force. And today, the United States dollar stands at the precipice of Phase 3, exhibiting every warning sign that preceded the downfalls of its predecessors. The pattern repeats with mechanical inevitability. The currency trap doesn't announce itself with dramatic headlines or sudden crashes. It unfolds across 4 distinct phases, each building pressure that becomes unbearable in the next. Understanding this pattern requires looking beyond individual policy decisions to see the structural forces that doom every reserve currency to eventual decline. The mechanism operates according to immutable economic laws that nations ignore at their peril. Phase 1 begins with trade dominance and currency supremacy, a period when a nation's money becomes the world's money because everyone wants what that nation produces. Phase 2 emerges when the reserve currency becomes too strong for its own good, pricing exports out of global markets and creating mounting trade deficits that grow larger every year. Phase 3 arrives when foreign powers, tired of losing competitive ground, force a coordinated currency adjustment that seems like a solution, but actually triggers the greatest danger. Phase 4 completes the cycle with economic stagnation, asset bubbles, or both, as the former hegemon discovers that reversing currency dominance proves far more destructive than building it. Each nation that entered this trap believed its situation was unique. The British thought their empire made sterling irreplaceable. The Japanese believed their manufacturing efficiency would overcome any currency headwinds. But the trap doesn't care about national characteristics or special circumstances. It operates according to an economic law first articulated by economist Robert Triffin in 1960. Any nation providing the world's reserve currency must run persistent deficits to supply that currency to global markets, but those same deficits eventually undermine confidence in the currency itself. This contradiction, known as the Triffin dilemma, turns strength into weakness with mathematical inevitability. Britain emerged from World War II victorious, but economically shattered. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world's surface found itself owing massive debts to the United States while trying to maintain the pound sterling as a global reserve currency, second only to the dollar. In 1945, the pound stood at $4.03 per dollar, a rate that reflected past glory rather than present reality. Britain had entered Phase 2 of the currency trap. By 1949, the fiction became unsustainable. The British government, led by Clement Attlee, faced a brutal choice between defending the pound's value and preserving its gold reserves. On September 18, 1949, Chancellor of the Exchequer Stafford Cripps announced a devaluation of 30.5%, dropping the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. The decision shocked the world financial system, triggering sympathetic devaluations in 23 other countries that pegged their currencies to sterling. Britain hoped this painful adjustment would restore competitiveness and allow its export industries to recover from wartime devastation. The 1949 devaluation bought 18 years of relative stability, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. Britain continued running persistent balance of payments deficits, meaning it imported more than it exported year after year. The country tried to maintain a welfare state, a global military presence, and a reserve currency simultaneously, a combination that economics professor Barry Eichengreen later called impossible arithmetic. By the mid-1960s, speculators recognized what policymakers refused to admit. The pound remained overvalued even at $2.80, and another devaluation was inevitable. The sterling crisis of 1967 unfolded with agonizing slowness throughout the year. Traders sold pounds and bought dollars, forcing the Bank of England to spend billions from its reserves to defend the exchange rate. The International Monetary Fund provided emergency loans totaling $1.4 billion, but confidence continued hemorrhaging. On November 18, 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced another devaluation, this time 14.3%, pushing the pound down to $240. Wilson appeared on television to deliver his infamous line, "This does not mean the pound in your pocket or purse has been devalued." But the British people knew better. The pound would never recover its former status. The 1967 devaluation triggered the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold pool, and set in motion forces that would destroy the entire post-war monetary system within 4 years. Britain had progressed through Phase 3 of the currency trap, the forced adjustment that seemed necessary but proved devastating. Phase 4 followed predictably: economic stagnation through the 1970s, the humiliation of an IMF bailout in 1976, and permanent loss of reserve currency status. The pound that traded at $2.80 in 1967 trades at approximately 1.27 today, a decline of more than 50% across 6 decades. The sun had finally set on sterling's global dominance. In 1985, Japan appeared unstoppable. Its manufacturing sector produced automobiles and electronics that dominated global markets through superior quality and competitive pricing. The country ran enormous trade surpluses, particularly with the United States, where the bilateral deficit reached $50 billion annually. Japanese companies purchased American assets, from Rockefeller Center to Columbia Pictures, in transactions that made headlines and sparked protectionist anger in Washington. Japan had entered Phase 2 of the currency trap, with a currency too weak to reflect its economic power. The yen traded at approximately 240 to the dollar in early 1985, a rate that American policymakers viewed as fundamentally misaligned. Treasury Secretary James Baker conceived a plan for coordinated intervention by the world's 5 largest economies to drive down the dollar and reduce American trade deficits. On September 22, 1995, finance ministers from the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and Britain gathered at New York's Plaza Hotel. They emerged with an agreement to actively sell dollars and buy yen and marks, forcing currency realignment through massive central bank intervention. The Plaza Accord worked faster and more dramatically than anyone anticipated. The yen, which stood at 240 to the dollar in September 1985, appreciated at 200 by November and 150 by 1987, a staggering 50% appreciation in less than 2 years. Japanese exporters watched their profit margins evaporate as products priced in yen became drastically more expensive for foreign buyers. Sony founder Akio Morita called it an unprecedented shock to the Japanese economy. The country had been forced into Phase 3 of the currency trap. Faced with this export-crushing currency appreciation, Japanese policymakers made a fateful decision. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates from 5% to 2.5% and held them there for more than 3 years. The government launched massive fiscal stimulus programs, flooding the economy with cheap credit intended to offset the pain of the strong yen. This monetary loosening succeeded in preventing immediate recession, but it ignited something far more dangerous: the largest asset bubble in modern economic history. Real estate prices in Tokyo soared to absurd levels, with the grounds of the Imperial Palace reportedly worth more than all of California's real estate combined. The Nikkei 225 stock index rocketed from 13,000 in 1985 to an all-time peak of 38,915 in December 1989, a 200% gain in 4 years. Japanese banks, awash in cheap money, made increasingly reckless loans secured by inflating property values. The bubble became self-reinforcing as rising asset prices justified more borrowing, which drove prices even higher. The inevitable collapse began in 1990 when the Bank of Japan, recognizing the danger too late, tightened monetary policy. Stock prices fell 60% over 3 years, wiping out trillions in wealth. Real estate values declined for 15 consecutive years. Japanese banks, holding massive portfolios of non-performing loans, stopped lending to preserve capital. The country entered Phase 4 of the currency trap, a deflationary spiral that economists would eventually call the lost decades. From 1991 to 2010, Japan's GDP grew at an average annual rate of just 0.8%. The vibrant economy of the 1980s became a textbook example of how currency manipulation, however well-intentioned, can destroy decades of prosperity. The warning went largely unheeded by other nations. The United States dollar has held reserve currency status since 1944, when the Bretton Woods Agreement established it as the anchor of the global monetary system. For decades, this privilege provided enormous advantages: the ability to borrow in its own currency, lower interest rates on government debt, and what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called America's exorbitant privilege of printing money the world needed. But privilege and trap are not opposites. They are sequential stages in the same process. Phase 2, warning signs emerged clearly after 2000. The U.S. trade deficit expanded relentlessly from $379 billion in 2000 to $958 billion in 2022, driven by persistent overconsumption and the offshoring of manufacturing to China and other low-cost producers. The current account deficit, a broader measure including investment income, reached $1.13 trillion in 2024, representing 3.9% of GDP. Like Britain in the 1950s and Japan in the 1970s, America spent decades buying more from the world than it sold back. accumulating foreign debts that grew larger every year. The imbalance became structurally embedded in the economy. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined steadily but unmistakably. In 2000, central banks held approximately 70% of their reserves in dollars. By the fourth quarter of 2024, that figure had fallen to 57.8%, the lowest level in decades. The decline accelerated after 2020, with approximately 11 percentage points of market share lost in just 4 years. This erosion doesn't represent a sudden crisis, but rather the slow grinding away of hegemony that precedes its collapse. The trajectory mirrors sterling's decline in the 1950s and 1960s. Phase 3. Entry points often involve coordinated pressure from rival powers, just as Britain faced in 1967 and Japan experienced in 1985. Today, that pressure manifests through de-dollarization initiatives that are no longer theoretical. China and Russia settled approximately 90% of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles by the end of 2024, completely bypassing the dollar. Brazil and China established yuan real currency swap lines to facilitate direct trade. India purchases Russian oil in rupees, saving an estimated $7 billion in exchange costs. These bilateral arrangements don't replace the dollar overnight, but they erode its necessity transaction by transaction, year by year. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, recently expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, have discussed creating alternative payment systems to rival SWIFT, the dollar-dominated messaging system that processes international transactions. Russia's system for transfer of financial messages and China's cross-border interbank payment system already process billions in transactions outside the dollar framework. Saudi Arabia, America's key petrodollar partner since 1974, now accepts yuan for oil sales to China. These developments mirror the pattern that preceded sterling's collapse, a slow but accelerating shift away from the hegemon's currency as trading partners find alternatives. The clearest sign that America has entered Phase 3 comes from its policy responses. Calls for tariffs to reduce trade deficits echo the desperate measures Britain took before its devaluations. Pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, despite inflation mirrors Japan's monetary loosening after the Plaza Accord. Rising asset valuations in stocks and real estate, driven by years of cheap money and deficit spending, replicate the bubble dynamics that destroyed Japan's economy. The United States exhibits every symptom of a nation in Phase 3, implementing policies that feel necessary in the short term but compound the crisis in the long term. History is repeating with uncomfortable precision. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but Phase 4 follows recognizable patterns. For Britain, it meant decades of relative economic decline, with GDP growth lagging behind Germany and France throughout the 1970s and 1980s. For Japan, it produced 3 lost decades of stagnation, deflation, and zombie banks propped up by government intervention. The United States will experience its own version of Phase 4, shaped by its particular circumstances, but driven by the same underlying forces. The most immediate danger is a dollar crisis that unfolds not through dramatic collapse, but through steady loss of function. The dollar may remain the largest reserve currency by percentage for years while losing its practical monopoly. When central banks hold 50% reserves in dollars, 25% in euros, 15% in yuan, and 10% in gold and other assets, the dollar's special status effectively ends. Markets require deeper liquidity, borrowing costs rise, and the United States loses its ability to finance deficits cheaply. Research by economists Barry Eichengreen and Camille Macaire suggests this multipolar currency transition has already begun, with the dollar's decline offset not by a single replacement but by a diversified basket of alternatives. The transition happens gradually until suddenly it doesn't. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible dilemma that parallels the Bank of Japan's predicament after the Plaza Accord. Maintaining low interest rates to support employment and economic growth risks accelerating inflation and further dollar weakness. But raising rates to defend the currency could trigger asset price crashes in stocks, bonds, and real estate, potentially causing a financial crisis. Britain faced this same choice in 1967 and discovered that both paths led to economic pain. The only question was which kind of pain to endure. Central banks cannot repeal the laws of economics, only choose which law to violate. Asset bubbles present the most insidious danger because they feel like prosperity until they burst. Japanese citizens in 1989 believed their stock market gains, and rising home values represented real wealth creation. Americans today see record stock market valuations and elevated real estate prices as signs of economic strength. But when central banks pump excess liquidity into an economy to offset currency appreciation pressures, exactly what Japan did and what the Federal Reserve has done repeatedly since 2008, those assets become inflated beyond sustainable levels. The unwinding can take a decade, as Japan learned, and the economic wreckage lasts even longer. Wealth built on monetary expansion evaporates when the expansion stops. The geopolitical consequences of Phase 4 extend beyond economics. Britain's loss of financial hegemony accelerated the dissolution of its empire and reduced its influence in global affairs. The United States military maintains bases in over 70 countries and projects power globally, commitments that become increasingly unaffordable as the fiscal situation deteriorates. Defense spending exceeds $800 billion annually. Sustainable only because the government borrows at low rates available to reserve currency issuers. When that privilege fades, choices become stark. Reduce military commitments, slash domestic spending, or accept significantly higher interest costs that consume ever larger portions of the budget. Imperial overstretch meets fiscal reality in Phase 4. The conventional narrative treats reserve currency status as an unalloyed good, something to be defended at all costs. But the four-phase currency trap reveals a darker truth. Becoming the world's reserve currency plants the seeds of eventual economic decline. The trap operates automatically, driven by forces beyond any single government's control. Britain couldn't avoid it, despite centuries of financial sophistication. Japan couldn't escape it, despite legendary industrial efficiency. The United States will not evade it through any policy combination currently under consideration. The contrarian insight is that Phase 4 might be necessary rather than preventable. Britain's economy eventually stabilized after releasing the burden of reserve currency status, allowing more balanced trade and monetary policy focused on domestic needs rather than global demands. Germany prospered after choosing not to make the mark a global reserve currency, instead concentrating on export competitiveness and manufacturing excellence. Perhaps the painful lesson is that reserve currency status functions as a loan from the future, buying decades of cheap borrowing at the cost of eventual reckoning. The United States stands where Japan stood in 1987 and where Britain stood in 1965, in Phase 3, implementing policies that delay crisis in the short term while making it more severe in the long term. The pattern suggests that Phase 4 is no longer preventable, only manageable. The critical question is not whether America can maintain dollar dominance indefinitely, history says it cannot, but whether policymakers will recognize the trap's operation before the crisis becomes catastrophic. Britain took 2 decades to adjust to reduced circumstances. Japan has still not fully recovered after 3 decades, and America's reckoning has only just begun. The 4-phase currency trap closes with mathematical precision, indifferent to the power, pride, or protests of nations caught inside it. The pattern has spoken.